David Manheim, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thanks, man. Very excited to be in the Zoom Riverside world with you, Doug.
I know it's crazy because we were just in person together last week in New York, and because of just timing, we had to do it virtually. But I also do video, so we couldn't have done video at your place. So I'm glad we were able to do it this way.
Totally. Not we could have gotten some kind of crack camera crew down to my father's house. That's always fun. But I'm super happy to be on your show. You are an inspiration, Doug Bobst. I swear.
Thank you. And so are you. And I really admire what you've built with the Dopey brand and how you've made recovery cool and you've given people a place to come to for them to feel like they're not alone and to feel like they can not only recover from addiction in a way that they feel wanted, but also people who maybe aren't recovered yet, but they want to, just giving people hope on that side of things. And I guess to start, look at what I'd like to ask you is you've obviously done a lot of interviews on Dopey. You've been in recovery for some time yourself. You've heard from a lot of the community and fans. Like, if you had to just give the listeners like 5 things that you think that people should do to be able to recover from addiction, what would they be?
Oh boy. 5 things to recover from addiction. Number 1 is don't use or don't drink. Don't put a mood or mind altering substance into your system. Number 1. Number 2, talk to somebody, share, be honest with somebody. It doesn't have to be a sponsor. It doesn't have to be a friend. It doesn't have to be a religious figure, just anybody, so that your truth is in somebody else's world and their truth is in yours. So you're participating. 3, be as active as you can. Being active, because really, in my experience, an addiction is rooted in my self-centeredness. It's rooted in my selfishness. So when I'm out of my horrible head, I am better off. And if it's exercise or if it's watching TV or watching movies or doing anything, shopping, even if you think it's harmful, it's probably less harmful than using or drinking. So being busy was the answer.
Right.
I think that was number 3. Okay, number 4 is I would say find something, meaning I got sober in 12-step recovery. And by no means do I think you need to be a member of a 12-step fellowship to be sober. But I've been thinking more and more about this as I talk to addicts and alcoholics. And I have this you want to hear my new analogy, Doug? Addicts and alcoholics are like hot air balloons, right? And we tether ourselves to the ground. And I think the more tethers we have, the less likely we float away. So with 12-step, I have a sponsor and I have sponsees and I have meetings and I have a program. I also have Dopey. I also have a family and children and a job. And I used to play music. I don't really play music anymore. It's about how many things can you do that if you used, you would lose. So it's my new tether analogy. So the more tethers you have, so if the program is like you have a really intense fitness regimen, but you also have a spirituality regimen, and you also do this podcast, and you also talk to addicts and alcoholics in recovery, and those things are all different tethers. And I think so someone out there, start tethering. I also the analogy of strip poker, and the more you do for your recovery is like reverse strip poker. Because if you only do one thing, you're going to wind up naked really quickly. But if you have a lot going on, you might not lose the game that quickly. So that's the second. I think that's it. I think that's my 5 things. I think it was only
Okay. Yeah,
4, but it's basically 5.
we'll go with that because I think it's important, right? To be able to not only obviously have to find what works for you. Like you mentioned, 12-step recovery, and people don't necessarily have to enter that world. I didn't enter that world, but it works for a lot of people. But you also have to, I think there's also common themes, right? That in order for any recovery program to work, you need to not use the drug or substance that you were abusing, right? You need to be able to talk to somebody. You need to keep yourself busy, and you need to find meaning in what you're doing and purpose, right? So that like you don't
That's a
you
good
can
one.
remember that. Yeah, that's what you said with the tethering. I think I was just summing that up, and that you have to find a deep reason as to why you're abstaining from a substance. Because if you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, or you're doing it because somebody told you to do it, you're not going to last very long. You really have to figure out like deep down, like why you're doing it for yourself.
Totally. I think when Chris and I started making the show, I had 4 months clean when we started, and we talked about this idea of self-actualization, which is like having a dream and how helpful it is in your recovery. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's like believing in something meaningful for you. And it's amazing.
For sure. And then, so when did you guys start Dopey? 10 years ago, maybe?
No, we started it in 2015, which is 7.5 years ago, in the fall of 2015.
That's awesome. So we're coming up here
on our eighth year.
On your eighth year. That's awesome. And I definitely want to get into that story because it's really fascinating and inspirational and sad, joyous, like all the things. But I want to go back, take me back to high school and talk about your experience where you were essentially like getting signed, I think, potentially with MTV, and then you self-destructed. So what happened?
When I went to high school in Manhattan, I went to elementary school and high school in the same spot. When I was 4, I took a test to get into a school, and I got into the school. And as many times as they asked me to leave the school, I didn't leave. And like, I wasn't a great student, but I had really good friends. And in your senior year of our school, and just some notable graduates from my high school, Young MC of Bust a Move fame, Max Kellerman of ESPN First Take fame, Bobby Lopez, who wrote Let It Go and all the music in Frozen, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote Hamilton.
Wow.
Right? And me from Dopey. So when you're a senior at our school, you have to get an internship. And somehow we had a friend whose father was a sound guy, and me and my friend Devin followed this kid, Alex, and he got an internship at MTV. So we got this internship at MTV, and that's kind of, I don't know, it was how I always was, but that's when the switch really got slipped for me. And not in terms of my addiction, but in terms of my like fame whoreness and wanting to I always wanted to have a talk show. So we got this internship, and I was driven for me and Devin to get on MTV. And we were in this office on like 57th Street, and we worked on a high school magazine show called Like We Care. And the MTV main offices were at a place called 1515 Broadway, the Viacom headquarters. And they would send us down there to bring tapes down there and to pick up. And whenever we would go down there, we would like wander around, and we met Kurt Loder. Kurt Loder was like the MTV news guy, and like he was always smoking weed and listening to the Harder They Come soundtrack. And we would try to meet people and get on MTV, and we did. We were funny and stupid, and they bought it and they put us on MTV. And we did a thing with the hair metal band Slaughter. They did the big song Up All Night, Sleep All Day, but I think you're much younger than me, so you're not familiar with the great work of Slaughter. And we went to a record signing with them. We went to a weird toy show at the Javits Convention Center, and then they canceled the show. But right before they canceled the show, they went to me and Devin, and they were like, "We think you guys are going to be the future of MTV." And I feel like it's a pipe dream now. Like Devin always says it to me, and I'm like, dude, I'm sure they say it to anybody that is decent. But basically, the show got canceled. And we were interns for high school credit, and we didn't sign off of, we're supposed to get like the supervisor at MTV to sign the form. And we didn't get him to sign the form. And I was just like, whatever, I'll forge it, or Devin, I'll sign it, or whatever. And we forged it, and we got caught. And I didn't graduate with our class because of it. And the MTV career didn't pan out. I wound up going back to MTV years later and producing a special for them later. And at that point, I was full blown heroin addict, shooting heroin. I really thought I had made it at that point, because I was like producing a special that was like, it was like John Mayer and Nora Jones, and it was hosted by Jason Schwartzman. And I'm like I have my own office at MTV, and I'm like shooting heroin and looking out on the park. And that was just right before I lost everything. But that was my MTV story, basically.
Let's talk about the in between. So how did it go from like you not graduating on time and getting in trouble with forging the signature? What happened after high school that led to your addiction to drugs?
I think that's really interesting because I never put that together. It started like MTV's sandwich of my personal misery. But it's interesting. After high school, I graduated that summer. I
Right.
had to take like a summer school class, and it wound up being a very cool class. I wound up taking the history of film at Hunter College, which was a lot of fun. And I was not an alcoholic or a drug addict at that point. I wound up going to college, and it was at college that I think my addiction really kicked in or started to really show itself. And I think maybe my addiction showed itself in codependency, that I had this really tight group of friends in high school. And then when I left, I was totally alone. And I
Mm.
felt that classic addict feeling of fear, not fitting in, totally on the outside, because I didn't have these kids that I had been with since I was like 4. And I'd played music in high school, and I started a band in college, and I was walking with this kid in college. His name was Zev. He was a cultural anthropology. Oh no, we met in cultural anthropology, but he was a jazz studies major. And of course, he was a pothead. And me and him were hanging out, like studying for a cultural anthropology test. And he was like, "Do you want to get stoned?" And I was like, "Okay." And because we were like, that's what college kids do. They get stoned before tests. And then you have to get stoned. Like you get stoned to study, and then you have to get stoned before you take the test so you remember. And I think the weed just really clicked with me. I was like, this is how I want to feel. And I literally smoke pot every day, probably from then till I was 41. So, like, as soon as we were smoking pot, I was taking acid. I think I took acid before I ever smoked pot. And then we were taking whatever pills were around, and I was smoking cigarettes. And I used mostly weed as a total crutch, as a total coping mechanism to deal with my uncomfortability. And eventually, I wound up in Manhattan, and I wound up getting another job in TV production at a different place. And I was like hosting stuff. It was really cool. I was hosting stuff, and I was assisting producing different stuff, like associate producing stuff and location scouting. And I had a friend move into my apartment who I had used to sold weed with in college. And I was like, you don't have to pay me rent. Just make sure that we have drugs. And we did. And he started delivering weed around Manhattan. And he started scoring a bunch of coke, and we would do coke. I never really liked coke because I think I was so naturally like up that the coke never hit me well, but I would do it anyway. And I was on a job for this company in Michigan at Michigan State University, scouting out a talk show, a college cable talk show. And I came home, and my friend who was living with me, his name was Todd. He was there, and 10 people from my college were there. And our drug dealer was there and selling them all coke. And I was like, and I
Mm.
thought I was really savvy. And I was like, dude, what are you going to give us for making you all this money? And he was like, okay. And he takes out 2 bags of heroin, and he throws them on the table. And I can remember like almost slow motion, the heroin going at it. And the kid was like 17. It was like the dealer was like 17. All the kids at our house were like 24. The heroin hits the table. Everybody leaves. Me and Todd snort the dope and get super high. It was a Sunday night, and we watched The Simpsons. And I was like, this is how I want to feel. And I think I only felt better the next morning when I was still high, but it was like the sun was coming up, and it was like perfection for me. And as a neurotic Jewish person, to have that feeling of tranquility, it was just like I wanted it. And I worked for this production company, and I was very careful to not get addicted to the heroin for a while until they gave me a deal. Like they gave me a 3-year contract where I made a bunch of money. Looking back on it, it wasn't that much money, but in my head, it was a bunch of money. And I was like, I can afford doing heroin. And I just jumped in and I was like, I'm not going to stop doing it. And I just started using every day.
There's so much to unpack there. And you mentioned that you felt like you were nervous about fitting in at college. You talked about wanting to almost be like the Beatles. And I think a lot of people, like, they want to emulate certain musicians that have done and abused drugs over the years. But what do you think it was like before that caused you to not like yourself or feel less than or feel like worried about fitting in?
I don't know. There were probably a bunch of things. Like I think in high school, like I was a little overweight, but like looking back at pictures, I wasn't that overweight. Like it was like a body dysmorphia thing. And I think my mom like was a little bit critical of how I looked. My nose was really big. It still is. But it wasn't a thing. I had girlfriends and I had friends. And I think, I don't know, like I rarely really delve into this. I think I was so dependent on those friends. So I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't had those friends from when I was very little till I graduated high school. And I'm still friends with them. Like they're still my best friends, those guys. And if I hadn't had them, I think I would have acted out in different ways in high school. In high school, I stole, I would steal, but I did very little bad stuff. I didn't drink because the alcohol just didn't affect me properly. I don't have an answer except I had the classic kind of addict thing that once my friends were gone, I was scared of not fitting in. I felt alone. Like I remember at night, I wouldn't really be able to sleep if I didn't have a friend sleeping over. I would get so caught up in weird thoughts and stuff.
And so what was your relationship like with your parents, like back then? You mentioned some stuff about your mom. Did they get along well? How did you interact with them? And how did you interact with them?
My parents were the best of friends. Like they were incredibly tight. They were so impressed that I had gotten into that school. Like my mother used to tell me she would scrub the floors so I could go to Harvard. And once I was 14 or something, it was pretty clear I wasn't going to go to Harvard. I
Yeah.
was often failing Spanish and math. And when I said they asked me to leave that school, I think I got two notifications where they were like, maybe he would do better if he went to the school in his neighborhood. And my parents mentioned it to me, and I was like, no thanks. The school in my neighborhood was rough. You know, I grew up in Chelsea and Manhattan, and the school in my neighborhood was called Humanities, and I don't know what would have happened to me if I had gone to humanities. I have no idea. Maybe I would have ruled humanities. I don't think so, though. I think it would have gone badly.
Right.
But my dad, like we a pretty close family. I have an older sister. Me and her were never too close. She went to college when I was probably 15. Me and my parents got along, but I learned at that point how to lie because my mom was very controlling. My dad would do whatever she said because he was very smart. It was like happy wife, happy life. And I learned at a young age to lie about everything I did just because I didn't want to hear it from my mother. And like my friends would come home, like I'd have friends come over all the time. And they learned what they would say is they learned very quickly not to answer any questions because they knew that I would come up with some total story. And so, like, lying for me and stealing when I was a teenager, I never talk about this. I never even think about this. But when I was a teenager, I constantly lied constantly to my mother because I didn't want her to tell me what I should have been doing. And I was very defiant in this weird sort of way. I hated people telling me what to do, but it never came out so antisocially. It was really like undercover antisocial. And it's funny to think about it. Me and my mom didn't have a bad relationship. It wasn't acutely bad. I knew she loved me. I just felt judged. I It's so funny because I talked to my AA sponsor about not feeling like I'm loved enough. And you'll never feel like you're loved enough. You're an addict. So like when I go over this kind of thing, was there an amount of love that I wasn't getting? All of my friends seem to have been doted on by their parents pretty hardcore, and I was not doted on. But I grew up in a nice home. You were at my dad's house. You met my dad. He's very sweet. He was pretty absent. He was
Mm.
like, he wasn't absent. We would go play basketball, and he was very good at basketball, and he was very good at school, and like, I never got better at anything. And I don't, part of me wants to blame him now, but I don't really have the best view of exactly what happened, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think some dots, it seems, are starting to connecting a little bit, because you mentioned your mom would say stuff to you about your weight. You mentioned that she would scrub the floors for you to go to Harvard. That's another like external like validation thing. You talked about your dad being absent. Do you think that a lot of your behavior growing up was because you didn't think you got like true like authentic validation and love from either your mom or your dad?
I constantly make fun of my father on Dopey, and I constantly say I became a heroin addict because of them. And in reality, I had a really good childhood. They were very
Right.
supportive. Like when I say my dad was absent, like he was a little absent-minded professory. Like he was
Hmm.
watching football or basketball, but if I needed anything, they would do it. It's if I had a party to go to out at Staten Island, my dad would drive me there and come and pick me up. Like they were incredibly attentive. I didn't feel like I was appreciated at the level that I wish I had been, but who knows? You know what I mean? I might have needed too much appreciation. I don't have a good sense of any of it, to be honest with you, Doug. If that answers the question. I don't have a feeling like I had a great childhood compared to a lot of people. I would have loved it if my parents were like, "Oh my God, David, you're so talented. You're so this, you're so that." My mom would say to me, like, because I didn't do great in school. I was at like this brilliant school, and I was like an artist. Ferris Bueller was my role model. And like my parents would go into parent teacher conferences, and I would be like, "Oh, I played that teacher like a Stradivarius." And the teacher would be like, "David thinks he's playing us like a Stradivarius." So like for me to sit here and say it was one way or another, I think it was both ways.
No, that all makes sense. And it's not to say that you didn't have a good childhood. I just think what happens sometimes, at least in my own experience and talking to other people, is that sometimes when we're not feeling quote unquote like loved or validated from our parents, we'll look for love in the wrong places. And you mentioned you cheated a little bit, with the MTV thing, you forged the signatures, you lied to not get caught, you ended up being the class clown, doing all these things to get attention, which may have felt good in the moment, but in reality, it was like the wrong form of attention.
Dude, I think you should become a psychologist because you're putting together for me that I don't think was that obvious. And I think that the number one thing about what you're saying, and Gabor Mate writes about it in his book, when people who are little don't go to their parents, but they go to their peers. And that's what I
Right.
was. I needed my peer acceptance way more than my parents. I grew up with a TV in my bedroom, and I like kissed the TV before I went to bed at night. Like I would come home, I'd close the door, I'd put on TV, and I was like, me and the TV, like the TV was my best friend. I had great friends, but I still know every TV theme song by heart. You know what I mean? Like I was plugged in big time.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the kind words, and it all makes sense, but I think it also, you see this a lot with people that struggle with their mental health and struggle with addiction, to where even though like you didn't have necessarily a quote unquote traumatic childhood, I think in moments where you're not getting certain validation for things that you do, or you're not getting certain validation for things you might achieve as a kid, you're only getting validation when things are bad. When you fail out of school or you did something wrong, then that becomes like a pattern. And now you're like, oh, for me to get attention and love, I got to do something wrong. And that's where it seems like a lot of the behavior came from.
I totally skated by. I got all of my good feelings from making people laugh at school among my friends. That was where all my validation came from. But I do sometimes wish I had tried harder. I don't know. I get it. Act out. Nobody caught me. Like I was rarely caught. And when I did get caught, it was pretty bad. I think you're right. I'm with you, Doug. I think you should. Have you considered psychology?
Yeah, in another life, I think, but they don't accept psychologists who have 2-year degrees, so I think I would need to go back to school for a little while to do
I
that.
don't know. I don't think it's a bad idea, but let's keep going. Let's keep going down this tour de force of my dysfunctional childhood. What else you got?
Oh, I definitely wanna get back to your story too and talk about we left off where you first started doing heroin and you were doing it recreationally, and then, obviously, eventually, it took a turn for the worse, but getting back to, like, some generic things, we talked about some of the things that you've learned from your own story and talking to others on the podcast about what people can do for recovery. I've had many experts on here. We've talked to people like Gabor Mate, and I've had Anna Lemke and people that really understand addiction talk about why people do drugs. So based on what you've heard from the listeners of your show, where you have a ton of people that write to you all the time about their addiction stories, what do you think is like a couple of the common things you hear?
It's funny. It's like I personally, in my belief about it, I don't look at the why that much.
Mm.
It's not my thing. Like I went to treatment many times. And I think as we sit here and run it through a strainer, we can see the remnants of these things that probably very well contributed to the why. I'm more about what happened and what was crazy about it. And then how are you living now?
Right.
So, but I think the why is like broken home, not getting enough love, dysfunction. What were your outlets? What was your economic standing? Like, what was your education? Like, I think most of our listeners that I hear from, and most of the people who are on the show, like, they came from some place where they didn't get enough love and they wound up feeling the good feeling of alcohol or drugs and being like, I like this more than I like that. And they go with it. And then the roller coaster begins. So I think they needed something they didn't get is the overwhelming why.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And I've definitely heard that a lot as well. So let's go back to your story. So you were with this guy, Todd, at your apartment in Manhattan. People were over. There's a bag of heroin on the table. You snort it. You realize this is how you want to feel
Yeah.
for the rest of your
Yeah.
life. Where does that take you?
I had signed a 3-year deal with this company called Burly Bear Network that was owned by Broadway Video, who's like Lorne Michaels, Saturday Night Live. And I think I made it to the second year of the 3-year contract. You know what I mean? I think first year I was interviewing rock stars like KRS-One, Pavement, Flaming Lips, Beanie Man, like Ween, whatever. It was a dream come true for me to be interviewing rock stars and hip hop stars. Like I talked to EPMD and just all these people that meant something to me. And I felt, and all the interviews were horrible. Every interview I did in that period was horrible. I was getting paid a lot of money. I was young. I was acting like an idiot in front of the camera and I was high. I was like, this is the ultimate thing to be like, all I ever wanted to do, it was like the age where people talk about like not giving a that's all. I don't even give a blah, 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 blah. And that was my dream to actually not give a because I cared so deeply about everything that I needed to do as many drugs as I could to actually not give a. And then when I did not give a, it got really bad. My show went to total and I became totally physically addicted to heroin. And I was only paying $300 a month for, you see where my dad lives in public housing in New York and it's very cheap. And my mother put me on the list for an apartment when I was 11. And I got the apartment when I was 22. And it was a giant studio apartment that I paid $300 a month for. And I couldn't even afford that. And I was making $100,000 a year at this production company. And I couldn't afford the $300 a month because I was snorting all the heroin at the time before I ever started shooting. And at the end,
What year was this?
that was 99, 2000.
Okay.
And I wound up breaching my contract with that company. And, but basically, I had the choice of either going to the company or going to my parents and saying, I'm addicted to heroin. I need to go to treatment. And for whatever reason, I didn't go to either. I just checked into a free detox at Beth Israel Hospital on 14th Street. And my parents found out And then my job found out. And because I didn't show up to work and I didn't tell them, they fired me for breach of contract. If I had gone to them, they would have had to send me to a nice rehab, but I was too stupid and strung out. And that's when my life got really bad. It just was incrementally worse and worse. It was around then that I started doing methadone. I was unemployed for a while, and then I went back to MTV because I had known when I was in high school, I had known this guy. His name was Alex Coletti. He started MTV Unplugged. He's like a genius. He did a ton of award shows, and he was really nice to me when I was a kid. And I wrote him or I called him and he was like, yeah, come in. And he hired me to do that special I was telling you about. And by that point, I had been to actual rehab. I had learned how to shoot heroin and I was shooting heroin. And I got hired to do a special for them. It was horrible, the special I made for them. And they aired it, then they fired me. As I was leaving MTV, I stole every CD on every desk because all you get is free CDs when you work at MTV. And I left MTV with 5 shopping bags of CDs and I went and I sold them all and bought heroin. And after that, I was on unemployment for another year and my parents were like, you got to go to real rehab. And they got me a scholarship to a rehab in Florida. And I went to Florida and my parents stopped paying my $300 a month. So I was extradited. I was gone. I was pushed out of New York City and I was like in Florida. And that's when that's when the real free fall, that's when the actual you're an addict and you're not going to be taken care of. And let's see what you do now really started. And I was probably like 26 at that point.
Do you think that a lot of this subconsciously you were just self-sabotaging because you just knew you were gonna fail anyway? And like you talked about in high school, you forged the signature and that ended up causing something with MTV and then the production company. And then you mentioned how you behaved in college and you talked about what happened at MTV where you stole stuff and you just really didn't put the effort in. Did you just think you were destined to fail?
I don't think so. And if I did, it was subconscious. What I like to believe is that I thought I could get out of anything. I thought I could talk my way out of anything. I thought I could sneak my way out of anything, lie my way out of anything. And I think without heroin, I could. But
Right.
once I was on heroin and benzos at that point, I was taking a ton of Xanax and Klonopin. I couldn't, I could lie myself out of a paper bag, but I would lie myself into another one. You know what I mean? It was total, I couldn't keep up with the lies. And I was just such a disaster. I was either nodding out or throwing up, being late, looking like a mess, filthy. I couldn't pull off. I was like a really good manipulator, like most drug addicts are. And I was a really good, like most drug addicts are. But once you're addicted to heroin and benzos, it's very easy to see through it. And I didn't realize how transparent I was at that point.
Right.
I don't think it was like, and maybe your point is 100%, and I'm still in denial of that period then. But I always thought I would succeed because I'm also
Yeah.
that crazy addict cliche of, yes, but I'm the piece of in the center of the universe kind of thing. You know what I mean? I'm the, what is it? Oh God, what is it? The something with the inferiority complex.
Yeah, I know what you're
The
talking about.
egomaniac with the inferiority
Mm.
complex. Like that, always thought I would pull it off. I always thought that I would pull it off and I failed and failed. But in the back of my head, I always thought I was going to pull it off. I don't think I thought I was going to fail. Is the
Right.
short answer to the question.
And I think the other theme that I'm hearing is that it seems that when you were a kid, you had to lie and BS your way to get like the proper attention from your parents, right? Because you were like afraid, specifically your mom, you were afraid of what she would say if you did something. So you would lie to make sure that certain things added up, correct? And that just became a pattern.
I think I wasn't as good at school as the other kids in my school, but I was better with people than them. I didn't have the same ability to do any like reading and interpreting information or doing math or learning foreign languages or understanding science. but I really had a great grasp of people. And I used that as my way through everything. And I think I got away. I think I tried to get away with all over the place. And I don't know, like I never put it together. That was how I sought attention. I think it was how I
Right.
survived.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense because you have to do what you need to do to survive. And it just seems you found your way and it served you today because you're tenacious, you hustle, you're good with people, and it's what's made you successful in the podcast world as well. And I want to go back to your story. So you're in Florida, your parents have written you off, you went down there to go to rehab, and now you're doing benzos, you're doing heroin, you're doing a whole concoction of things. What's the day-to-day like for you there? And how were you surviving? Where were you living? And then how did that ultimately lead you to getting sober?
I was in Florida for a year and I wasn't using. I was in treatment, and I got kicked out of treatment for hooking up with girls in treatment. And then I did maybe 11 months in Delray Beach, Florida. And I was like confronted as the most toxic person in the rehab. Like it was, and I worked at a furniture moving company, and all I wanted to do was get back to my life. And I relapsed on weed. I started smoking pot down there and I got away with it. And then I left. But my parents wouldn't let me come back to New York. I had lost my rent controlled apartment and I moved to California because that kid, Todd, who I lived with, was living in California with another friend that I had grown up with. And I moved into their house and they were like, we got to make sure Dave doesn't relapse on heroin. But Todd had started doing crystal meth. And I was like, I'll do that. And I started doing crystal meth with Todd. I think I made it a few weeks before I was seeking downers. I didn't respond well to crystal meth. And we went to Mexico. We bought his pills. I had a girlfriend who moved out there to be with me. And very soon after that, I was working on a TV show out there. And I was working near downtown LA. And I was smoking Marlboros, and some homeless guy comes up to me and he looked high and he's, hey, can I get a cigarette? And I was like, I'll give you two if you tell me where I could get heroin around here. And he's, yeah, right across the street. It was like open air drug market and I didn't realize it. And I give him the two cigarettes and then bam, I got so addicted in Los Angeles to heroin and pills. It was insanity. I moved in with my girlfriend. I lived there for 6 or 7 years. I joined a methadone clinic. I got up to 150 milligrams of methadone. I gained probably 50 pounds. Like I didn't work. And all I would do is heroin, pills, and methadone. And that was all I did for 5 years. Nothing else.
What year was this? What time frame was this?
That was like 2002 to 2007. And I was a disaster. I didn't had a couple jobs, but they were jobs like famously, I got a job working at kids' parties and I would do it high. I had to blow up balloon animals. They would have me wear like the Mighty Morphin Power Ranger suit and I was all fat and disgusting. And then they had me dress up as Big Bird, but they give you this Big Bird costume with this matted feathers and googly eyes, like it's this off-brand Big Bird outfit, and they don't give you tights. So I'm high on heroin, hairy legs, Big Bird body, Big Bird feet, white, pasty, hairy legs in between. I would go to parties late, high, reeking of cigarettes. It was really bad. And on methadone, like even if I had no money, I would spend whatever money I had on drugs before I would get the methadone. And I didn't know what the hell I was going to do, to be honest with you. I thought I was totally, and I got a call from my mother and she had been diagnosed with leukemia. And she told me that she thought she was going to die soon. Right. And this is out of nowhere. She was a healthy 64-year-old woman. And I was like, I can't have her die with me out here like this. I can't live with that. I was like, I can't live with that being my story. So I went to the methadone clinic and I was like, I got to get off methadone. They put me on a blind taper. I tapered off of 150 milligrams for probably 10 months, some crazy amount of time. I got down to 30. I went to treatment. I relapsed a bunch of times, and me and my girlfriend moved back east. We moved to Vermont. My parents had a house upstate, and I would see them on the weekend, and I had gotten off of heroin and methadone. I still smoke pot. She died that fall, and I was smoking weed, but I wasn't sober. I moved back to the city. I broke up with the girlfriend because I was just such a destructive, toxic kind of thing because I had been strung out the whole time. And that's when I started working at Katz's. And I was like, it was really weird. I had worked at Katz's Deli when I was in high school and in college. And I was like, and I hadn't lived in my parents' apartment since I was in high school. And I was 35. And I was like, Mom, can I move back home? And she's only if you get it, if you're working. So I called up Katz's and they let me come back. And I think I lived in their house for a month. I didn't even live with them for the second they came back from upstate, I left because I couldn't live. It's too small of an apartment to live with them. And also all of the psychological damage that you've uncovered in this interview. I had to leave. And I went and I lived at my friend's mom's house. And then my mother died. And right after that, I started dating this woman and she got pregnant. And then I relapsed on heroin. It's a lot to unpack, Doug. I know. It's a deep, crazy story.
My first question is, you mentioned how you continue to get these production jobs or jobs in film doing this stuff. Like, how did you get that? How did you get another job doing that in California, given your horrific track record? You mentioned that they fired you for breach of contract. The one production company, you stole the CDs and then you did you not report? Did you not write down any of that on the resume?
No, of course not. Of course, I didn't write. I just wrote down like producer. You know what I mean? Location scout, producer. I wasn't gonna write breach of contract, stolen goods.
They didn't call them as like a reference to see how you were. No,
I don't know. I don't know. I've never found out. When I got to LA, I got a job as an associate producer for this TV show called 9 on the Town, and I did that job high. Like I was high, like as high as I've ever been. I remember it's like one of my most glorious war stories. They had a bathroom off of the production room. And I thought I was such an egomaniac, crazy person. They had a bathroom in there and they had like drawers in the sink. And I took the middle drawer and I put comics in there because I would always like go to the bathroom and take it and read comics because I'm an idiot. And I had a tissue box in that same drawer. And in the tissue box, I had a tourniquet, used needles, cookers, and I would just shoot heroin in the bathroom. I would cook the heroin in the bathroom. I would shoot heroin. It was like, and I would shoot meth in there too. I was so crazy at that job. I had that job for maybe 6 months. And I remember like the woman calls me in to fire me and she's, you can't work here anymore. And I was like, why? It's obvious you have a horrible problem. And I was like, no, I was just lying. I was like, no, I just can't sleep. And she's, that's because you're on meth. We can smell it. We can smell you cooking the meth. And it was bad. Like, but I mean, like when I tell you the story, it sounds like I was working way more than I was. I got that one job in California and I didn't work again there for 5 years.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Gotcha.
All I did was live off my girlfriend, find quarters in the couch, wander down the hill, buy an ice cream sandwich, come back up, find another 50. All I did was eat ice cream sandwiches, shoot dope, drink methadone, and take out of focus pictures of flowers. That was all I did. And watch TV, like watch Lost. And I was like a disaster. I was not some hustling TV working production guy. I was a total waste of life.
Where was your mindset at, like in the midst of all of this, like in the time where you're living in California and then you're transitioning back to New York to be there for your mom? Like, did you actually want to get sober? Did you believe you could get sober, or did you just think that you were going to end up being an addict for the rest of your life?
I don't really know the answer to that question. I don't think I ever thought I was going to be an addict for the rest of my life. I wanted to be, though. I remember I'd always be like, I wish I just had enough money and I could just stay high forever, which is every addict thinks that. And I also had this thing, if I could just get sober, if I could, and I would say, if I could make it to 60 or somehow in my head, I was so grandiose. I was like, if I could just make $60 million, or when I make $60 million, I could be totally a junkie. Like it was always a temporary thing in my head, but sobriety didn't exist. I was so addicted, forget heroin and benzos. I was so addicted to heroin and benzos, I had 20 seizures at that point.
Wow.
Like I was having like crazy seizures, like hospitalization seizures over and over again. I was hospitalized like 5 times from seizures in bad places. Like I had a seizure on a plane. They had to take me off the plane. I had seizures in treatment. I just had I had seizures doing community service in California. Like I had seizures all over the place just because I was so addicted to the benzos. So no, I didn't think I was ever going to get sober, but I also didn't think I was going to be a drug addict for the rest of my life. I think I still had that grandiosity to think that I was going to make it out. And when my mom got sick, I wasn't like, I'm going to get sober. I was just like, I got to stop doing heroin. I really need to stop doing methadone, and I need to stop taking pills because I knew the pills were why I was having the seizures. So I just figured I wanted to get back to being a stoner. I was not interested in sobriety.
Gotcha.
And that's what I wanted when I left California.
Right. And as we all know, that's just, as much as people want that, it's just not reality, because your life, no matter what, your life will eventually just there'll be a path of destruction no matter what if you continue to use an exorbitant amount of drugs, despite no matter how much money you have.
Yeah, it's because like the drugs stopped working. So I wound up relapsing on my mother. Like my mom died. My girlfriend got pregnant, and I was hanging out with Todd again, and Todd had showed up with heroin.
So did he move back from California to New York?
He moved back from California years before I did because he couldn't handle it at all. We actually drove back together. We got arrested probably we got picked up 5 times or something driving back. Every time, like Todd had like a pound of weed in the car, and every time the cops would just find a little bit. It was horrible. And also for some reason it was like AMC. It was like, you know how like AMC like would do a week where they just show Rocky movies?
Yeah.
Like they'd show Rocky and then Rocky 2 and then so every day we would stop somewhere, we would watch the next Rocky movie, and we would get busted. It was like we were in the hotel and in the car, and it was by the time we got to Buffalo, New York, we were out of weed. And Todd was so upset at me. We smoked our last joint in Buffalo. And then I went back to California, and Todd established himself in New York. So I came back 5 years later. Todd wasn't on heroin. He would do coke once in a while. He would do heroin once in a while, but he wasn't totally addicted. But me and Todd were not good for each other. And when I came back, he was like, he would always challenge me, and he would be like, I bet you can't find dope now. And like, we didn't have it connects or anything. And I would be like, I could get dope anywhere, anytime. And he'd be like, prove it. And I would go out and get dope. And then he started using and I wouldn't. And then Linda got pregnant, and Todd showed up at our house with heroin. And I think the pressure of expecting this kid, working in a deli full time, that I just succumbed. I succumbed. I don't know if that's a word. I managed to wind up back on heroin. We had the baby. My partner found out I was on heroin, and she left me. And that's when hell really descended. Like all these bottoms were nothing compared to that bottom, because I had a kid. I was a total failure. I was totally addicted to heroin. I was doing probably $300 worth a day at that point. I was alone. I was estranged from the family. I was waiting tables and managing Katz's, just loser time. And that's when I went to treatment and I met Chris, who I started Dopey with.
Let's go back to that in a second. I want to unpack something. So you mentioned that you spent a lot of time with Todd knowing that he wasn't good for you. Why do you think that, just despite the fact that you knew this person wasn't good for your best interest, you continued to like almost like cling to him, almost like a brother, even though you knew it would lead to debauchery?
Because I wanted the debauchery. I love Todd. Todd was like one of the most fun people anyone could ever meet. He was ridiculously enthusiastic. He was a up. Like, he was like me. We were both ups. We loved like hippie culture. We loved TV. We loved doing stupid, getting away with stealing, getting high. Like, we were idiots. He was like the lowest version of myself, and I would descend to an even lower version of him. Like, we were like that for each other. And I think it was addictive. It was seductive in this way. It was not like I wasn't looking to do the next right thing. You know what I mean? I think what you described is a great way to describe it. We definitely clung to each other like brothers. And I think I couldn't handle loneliness. I think that's what we talked about. Like when I was in high school with my friends, I could not handle being by myself. And Todd always just thought I was worse than him. So I was like a good comparison for him. And I needed someone to be next to me all the time, or I felt totally empty.
Gotcha. Yeah, because it seems like you said you had some codependency issues with people where you needed to have people around you
100%.
to feel validated. And I think sometimes when you come up and you don't have a close relationship with your family, because we are wired for human connection, you will find human connection whether people are good for you or not, because like it's a biological need is people. You need to be around people.
Yeah. Yeah. Loneliness and fear of being alone definitely drove a lot of what I did.
Makes sense. All right, let's go back to the story. So you're working at Katz's, and for those listening who aren't familiar with Katz's, it's what, like arguably like one of the most famous delis in the country.
I think it's the oldest deli in the world. It's probably the most famous deli in the world because the very, very famous scene from When Harry Met Sally, when she fakes an orgasm and then the old lady says, "Oh, I'll have what she's having." That's what made it a very famous place. And I had worked there as a kid. My dad's cousin bought into the restaurant in the 80s, and I just had entree to working there like forever. And I knew it. And it's a really special place though. People, whenever anybody says New York isn't like New York, if you go to Katz's, you realize it still is. Like the guys at Katz's are very much old New York. It's a very magical place. Shameless plug for Katz's.
Shameless plug for Katz's. And from what I understand, you can actually like order online, right? And have stuff shipped to you.
Oh, that's a real shameless plug. Yeah, you can order online and have stuff shipped to you. Totally.
I was talking to a client. Talking to a client about it, about just going. And I was like, man, I got to get up there. I haven't been there yet before I came up to the city the last time. And he was like, I've actually heard that somebody in his family had ordered it online and said that it was still like really good.
Yeah. We cut it. Everything's hand cut. They vacuum seal it, and then you like boil it in the bag, and it comes out almost like it was cut right there. Yeah, it's good.
Nice.
1-800-HOT-DOG. Katz'sDelicatessen.com.
I'll make sure to plug that in the show notes because I do think that, from what I understand, it is a magical place. But nonetheless, you're working at Katz's. You meet your now partner. You guys have a kid together. You're strung out on heroin. Bad. She leaves you. What's going through your mind as that all went down? What was your mental health like? What were your thoughts like? And then how did you end up finally going to treatment?
It's like, it never was as bad as that. And I guess that's probably the truth for anybody's story when they get to the end of the line. And I wasn't even at the end of the line. I was basically at the end of the line for heroin addiction. And holy cow, those days were bad because I had more money than I had ever had at that point, and I could afford doing as much dope as I wanted. I just felt worthless. I felt like whatever loser I imagined that I might be, I was 100 times worse because now there was a child. And my mother was dead. My father was in so much pain because my mother was gone. And I had this beautiful baby girl that my father loved so much, and he was in so much pain. And then his son, this perennial up, can't get his together. And I just felt it all. I felt so low, like such a loser. It was so painful. And I used to get through it. And I remember it was bad. I remember I went out drinking and I didn't drink. I went out drinking one night on the Lower East Side to try to pick up a girl or something. That was in my head. And nobody would talk to me. And I remember I was walking home from the bar and I literally walked into a wall, broke my nose, got a black eye, broke my nose, went out to see my daughter. And her mother was just like, because they left, they moved to Long Island and I moved to the Lower East Side. And she was like, and I was like, and I knew it. At that point, I was like so strung out, broken nose, black eye. Oh, and I had gotten fired from Katz's. I forgot about that. I got fired from Katz's because I was so high at work. I was nodding out. I was eating food off the customers' tables.
What?
Literally. I was a nightmare. And I lost the gig. I got fired. I broke my nose, black eye. Told Linda, she was like, you got to go to treatment. I went and I talked to my cousin who was owning Katz's, and I was like, please, if I go to treatment, can I please come back and work? And he was like, you can come back and work, but you're never going to manage the store again. That's over. You can come back and you can wait tables. It was like the curse of Katz's kind of thing. And I went to Mountainside. I remember I went to a detox in Connecticut and nobody would talk to me because I had like black eye, broken nose. I shot heroin and took pills on the ride up there. So I got there just like people in detox who are like, you can't talk to them because they're just like ruined. I was as ruined as I've ever been when I walked into that place. And at Mountainside, I met Chris, who I started Dopey with. But I didn't even get sober after that. I got home. I found I had new needles at home, and I was like, I can't have new needles and not use. So I relapsed again. And then I put a year together to get back custody of my daughter. And I got to see my daughter on the weekends without my dad. And then I think Hurricane Katrina or Sandy, one of these hurricanes happened, and I started smoking weed again. And I got sober after that. But that's the way it happened, if that makes any sense.
No, it does make sense. So you end up going to treatment, you meet Chris, you end up getting out of treatment and then scraping up some time together. And then you end up getting back into smoking weed after Hurricane Katrina happens. And then you finally end up like getting sober.
But the sober thing at the end, right? During the whole time, like after we had our daughter, I was so miserable that we were separated and that I was separated from our daughter and that we could have this beautiful family. And I was the thing standing in the way of it. And I was obsessed with this idea of a family. And Linda, my partner, was like, no way. I can't trust you. I'm not interested. And then I had gotten the year together. She needed hair tests of a year sober to be with me or to have me see our daughter. And I got the year. I think I had a few drinks. Like I was dating, like she was seeing people, I was seeing people. And if I went on dates, I would drink because I didn't know how to operate otherwise. And I wound up dating this woman. Linda was in a relationship with someone else. And I wound up smoking pot. And I didn't tell Linda. But the whole time, and it's not that romantic a story when I'm actually honest about what happened. But the whole time, all I really wanted was to be with Linda and our kid. And I wound up breaking it off with this woman. And that's also when I started getting into my dream. And my dream was having a talk show. So I started doing a talk show at Katz's called The Last Jewish Waiter. And it's about this waiter who wants to have a talk show and he hates waiting tables. So he does the talk show while he waits tables. And like people liked it. And Linda was impressed that I was doing something. And I was constantly like, can we please get back together? Can you stop seeing this guy and get back together with me? And we could have a family and this and that. And then over the summer, she was like, okay, we can try. And we like went out. We went on a trip to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And she took Xanax to help her sleep. And I wound up stealing the Xanax from her. And she got really pissed. And then she gave me another chance. But by the time she gave me the other chance, some guy who I worked with was selling Klonopins. And I started taking Klonopins. And she caught me again. And she was like, this isn't happening. You're losing custody. And I had my own version of a spiritual awakening, it was in August of 2015. I was sitting on Grand Street, chain smoking Barbaros and writing an email to her, begging her to let me smoke pot, that I could be a good father. I could be a good partner. It could work out if I could just smoke pot. And something happened where I looked at myself and I was like, what the am I doing? Begging to smoke pot. I was 41, had failed over and over and over again. What if I just tried to actually do it without the pot? And the next morning, I went to a 12-step meeting, and there was a kid at the 12-step meeting who was 28. He was super handsome and fit. He had like tattoo sleeves on his arms, and he was celebrating 10 years. And I was like, who the is this guy? I was like, this is the most annoying guy I've ever seen. I didn't have a day. He had 10 years, and he was 28 and had it together. And I think I went up to him to complain to him, to tell him how annoyed I was that he was doing so well. And he was super nice. And he was like, oh, so is today going to be your first day then? And I was like, maybe it is. And I went home and I called my best friend, and I gave the guy from the MTV story, I gave him all the pot, and he took all my pot out of my house, and I got sober. That was it.
Dang. Got sober and that was it. It wasn't just it, because I know there's been a lot of work that I'm sure you've had to do. What's the healing process been like for you to work on a lot of the stuff that you had gone through before that time, and also to unlearn some of these unhealthy behaviors?
I was so obsessed. I wasn't obsessed with weed at that point, and I wasn't obsessed with heroin, and I wasn't obsessed with pills. I was obsessed with Linda, and I was obsessed with our daughter, and I was obsessed with how I could have this thing up. You couldn't have a conversation with me in that period of time without me lamenting everything I had done. How could I f this up? I probably said that 1,000 times every day. I can't believe I f this up. How could I f this up? I never stopped saying it. I was so obsessed. I was a broken record. Even my dad didn't want to talk to me. Nobody wanted to talk to me. And I went to that 12-step meeting, and I remembered the phrase. The phrase was, if you do this, the obsession to use will be lifted. And I just wanted the obsession to my failure to be lifted. So, I had never worked a real program. I had tried, I had gotten a little bit of time together. I had done a few steps. I never worked the 12 steps. I never felt sober. I never felt rigorously honest. I never felt good. I always was pining away to get high. And when I went to those meetings, those first couple times, I heard somebody read this piece of literature called How It Works, where they say, rarely have we seen a person fail who thoroughly followed our path. And I had never followed anything. All I had followed was using and lying and cheating and stealing. And I was like, I want these results. And I remember I'm sitting in a 12-step meeting on Houston Street, and I was 41, and I was the best I had ever been. I had a waiter job. I had a sublet apartment, and this was the best I had ever been since I was a kid. But when I was a kid, I was a kid. I was like, this is what using gives me at 41. I was like, if I'm lucky, I'll live to be 82. If that's half my life just using, what would half my life being sober bring me? Was my thought. And I was also like, I know I'm never going to get as high as I was. I know I've gotten as high as I'll ever be. So what if I try this? So I got a sponsor, and I did the steps, and I did everything that was suggested. I went to 90 meetings in 90 days. I dotted my I's. I crossed my T's. I did not do anything that wasn't suggested. And I became a cult member, and it totally worked.
That's amazing, man. Congrats to you on that. What was the process like for you to overcome the feeling of being a failure?
It was strictly, I met a few guys in recovery. I chilled with them. I hung out with them every day. They felt like failures too. I talked to people who had been through what I had been through, and it galvanized my spirit to not up. And it was very shortly. I also talked to Chris. Chris had 2 years sober at that point, and he loved The Last Jewish Waiter, and he loved the attention that I had gotten from doing The Last Jewish Waiter. And he was like, I want to do something like that. And I was like, and I had another friend who was like, you should do a podcast about drug stories. And I was like, we should do a podcast about drug stories. I was a musician, so I knew how to record music onto my computer. And I was like, just come over and we'll record. I had 3 months sober, 4 months sober, 3 months sober when we started talking about doing Dopey. The first episode we did, I had 4 months sober. And that was a huge, it wasn't like people always ask Dopey's place in my recovery. I don't know, but I know that Dopey was a good time. It was what I wanted to do. Like making the show was exactly what I wanted to do. It was this opportunity. And me and Chris had so much fun.
I know you guys did it for a few years together. Walk the audience through, was it 2000, around 2018 or so, 2019? With
Yeah, it was, I think it was, let's see, I think it was 2018, but I always up the years because my brain is addled from drug use. Basically, he relapsed. He injured his leg, he relapsed, and I think he probably did Percocets, and as soon as he did Percocets, all bets were off, and he was doing coke and fentanyl, and he overdosed and he died. But before he died, Todd died. Todd died 5 weeks before Chris died, and I was broken. When Todd died, I want to cry every time I think about what happened to him. He never got it together. He never got any recovery. He died. 5 weeks later, Chris was dead. And I could not believe it. And his girlfriend had found his body. And I didn't even believe it was true. And I could quit making the show or I could not quit making the show. I didn't really consider not making the show. I loved making the show. It was all I really wanted to do. So I kept making the show. We had an audience before Chris died, but after Chris died, we were featured on This American Life and the show got much bigger.
It's really sad that it took that for the show to get bigger. And I can't imagine how hard that all must have been for you. Like, how did you keep it all together for your partner and your kid, your own sobriety during that time?
It was crazy because also Linda had gotten pregnant again. So basically in 2018, in May of 2018, we had our second daughter. We moved into our first house. And in June, Todd died. And in July, Chris died. It's crazy. But I think having a baby, it's like I couldn't really stop. I couldn't stop working. I couldn't stop my recovery. I galvanized my recovery because I was in so much pain from his loss. And I just doubled down, tripled down on program, doubled down, tripled down on work. Family required much more effort. It was a crazy thing. And it's a miracle that it worked out. And it's only because I've stuck to a recovery program. And it's also like all of about my egomaniacal ways when I was a kid, like turned into this. And it's whatever. Like our show is not a big podcast, but it's successful. It makes me a little bit of money. It helps a bunch of people. We have an audience that really likes it and it makes me feel good. And I love doing it. It's in the end, it's all worked out and I'm almost right-sized about the whole thing.
Yeah. Congrats to you for keeping it all together despite all the tragedy that you went through during that time and all the pressure from being a dad, having a partner, and then having another kid. Like, I'm sure that had to all be incredibly tough. I'm interested to hear though, like, what have you done in your recovery that's got you comfortable with just David Manheim yourself? Because you've mentioned this obsession with being around other people. You've talked about this fear of being alone. What have you done to what have you done through the years to actually be comfortable with yourself?
I think I've reproduced. So I have two people that need to be with me. So that helps. Yeah. No, I think doing my step work, I think having a program, I think trying to do the next right thing, trying to be of service, trying to stay out of my head and be more other centered has been helpful. But to be honest with you, like, I'm still codependent. I'm still crazy. I'm not perfect. I had a sponsor when I was in Narcotics Anonymous who said, he was very smart. He said, "You're not going to be a saint. This is not something that's going to turn you into a saint. It's a bridge back to life. And then you're going to have problems like everybody else. And I have problems like everybody else. I have desires like everybody else. I up like everybody else. I don't use. And I try to triple down on my program to keep me doing the next right thing."
So with as far as the podcast, I know you've had some pretty incredible guests on the show. You've met some amazing people at Katz's. Who's been like the one person that people may recognize that's been the most meaningful, that's had the most meaningful conversation with you?
The most recognizable person is probably Jamie Lee Curtis. And that was a total fluke. She was at Katz's buying a Knish for her husband. And I went crazy to get her to come on the show. She wouldn't come on the show until after Chris died, when she found out the show was a comedy. She was like, "No, I don't want to do a comedy about addiction." She was the most notable person. I've had a lot of great conversations with addicts, both famous and not famous. Marc Maron was a very gratifying one because I really admired his work, and I got to know him a little bit better. And he came on to our show twice, and I got to go on his show, which was incredible to me. But the second time he came on Dopey, he shared about the loss of his girlfriend, like who died during COVID. And he was very vulnerable, and that was very meaningful to me. I had an episode that not many people listen to, but there's this hip hop guy called Nems, Gorilla Nems from Brooklyn. He's like an Instagram guy now. He does this whole bit. He's, "Don't disrespect me." Like, he like disses people on the street. But he like had a crazy story, and I just felt super connected to him. Yesterday, I interviewed Andre Royo, who played Bubbles on The Wire.
Ooh.
And it blew my brains out of my head. It was just like, I lived for The Wire. I
Yeah.
used and watched The Wire. I got sober and watched The Wire. I relapsed and watched The Wire. That's just like scripture in my soul. And it was like a really cool connection. So that was great.
That's incredible, man. The Wire is not far from me, and I've definitely watched it a bunch of times. It's
Right.
cool you had Bubbles on. I wanted to get Omar on. I'd actually been in conversation with his Michael K. Williams' team shortly before he had passed, and we just never
Yeah.
able to get it set up.
Yeah. I wanted that one too, real bad. Him and David Crosby, man, like when David Crosby died, I was like, oh God, that was David Crosby blocked me on Twitter famously. And
Wow.
because I would always tweet at him, like, "Who's the worst crackhead, you or Rick James? And did you do more dope than James Taylor?" I would just tweet stupid things at him, and he'd block me. And I always had hope that he would come on eventually. And he never did.
Yeah, man. It's sad though when people's lives get taken too soon. And I think that's why we keep doing what we're doing. I know that's a big inspiration for you with Dopey, and why you continue to show up every week and produce a great episode and interview people and do the work that you're doing. So I guess my last question is, what's next for you? I know you're going to continue with Dopey. You're still doing stuff at Katz's. Where do you see yourself in the next few years?
Who knows? I personally believe in Dopey. I think I'm good at this. I don't want to sound crazy. I think I do good interviews. I think Dopey is an entertaining show. Time magazine is working on a documentary series about us, but do you know how many, I've had so many near run-ins with actual fame that haven't happened, that I'm not really banking on this thing to do anything. But Dopey does something by itself. I think I'm just going to keep doing it. Hopefully we'll get better guests, and Robert Downey Jr. will be on it, and I'll be chilling with Flavor Flav and whatever. I just want Dopey to be, I don't want it to be mainstream, but I want it to be the brand that mixes comedy, entertainment, addiction, and recovery. Like, in a world like where that is palatable to a mainstream audience. I would like that. I'd like to write a book, whatever. I don't know. I just want to keep going. I want to make more money and get more famous and have everything that I want and no problems and everyone loves. That's what
All the things. Have you found yourself like in chasing after these celebrities to come on the show? That becomes like an addiction in itself sometimes.
I think it's more of an exercise in like self-esteem, like losing self-esteem, gaining
Mm.
self-esteem in places that aren't necessarily esteemable. One of the most, okay, it's incredibly satisfying to actually get a guest, right? But what I find to be almost equally satisfying is to give up. For example, Courtney Love. I've been chasing Courtney Love for years, and she used to talk to me once in a while. But then, like, she stopped talking to me, and I kept texting her because I'm such a. I sound like such a loser. But the other day, I just was like, accept that I'm not going to get her, and I unfollowed her, and I'm like
On
free
Twitter, on
of that
Instagram.
obsession on
Yeah.
everything. I'm done. I'm through. It's over. And so, yes, I have spent a lot of time chasing celebrities to come on Dopey. And sometimes it's addictive. And it definitely, with my self esteem, both positively and negatively.
Yeah,
100%.
I'm sure it's like the chase in that sometimes what's more, what feels better is like the chase of getting the process of getting the celebrity. And then once you get them and you interview them, like sometimes it was a good interview, it was a great interview, but was it worth the stress? Like you don't know.
Totally. But it's just like chasing the
Right.
drugs. It was totally like, if I couldn't get, like when Todd was like, you can't score. And I'd be like, yes, I can. That's what this is. And it's also like, how can I prove that I'm good enough to get a person to make this happen, to make that happen? And really, the show is just as good with somebody who's just honest and compelling and funny and has a great story as a celebrity who sucks. You know what I'm saying? Not every celebrity is going to be great. Not every celebrity is going to get you listeners, but it is some weird inferiority complex that makes me think I need validation by getting said famous person. So it's interesting. It's another way to be okay with being myself.
Right. Right. That all totally makes sense. Dave, this has been awesome. Thank you again for coming on and being vulnerable and open and honest and sharing your story. If people want to follow along with the podcast, if they want to follow you on social media, where's the best place to do that?
Wherever you listen to podcasts, just write in Dopey and you'll find the world of Dopey.
The world of Dopey. I'll make sure to include the link to that stuff in the show notes, as well as the link to Katz's in case people want to check that place out as well.
Oh, real quick, there's 30 people with Dopey tattoos, which is very gratifying. We've sent 40 people to treatment. Like we call it the Doposphere. You can join the Dopey Nation. And Doug, you're in the Dopey Nation.
Yeah, I'm in the Dopey Nation.
All right, good. And you're going to be a big fitness contributor to our show, which I'm very excited about.
Me too, man. I'm looking forward to getting plugged in and helping the Dopey Nation however I can.
That sounds good to me. I really appreciate coming on your show. I hope I didn't sound too full of myself.
Nah, man, you were good. And for those listening, what I invite you to do is to share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Dave said about recovery, about addiction, about his incredible story, the ups and downs and everything in between. Whatever the takeaway was, make sure to tag Dave, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst. We'll see you next time.